Welcome everyone to our third webinar in the series on how to grow peace journalism. My name is Bob Akbahadur. I'm based at George Washington University. And this series is trying to re-examine how the media, communications, and news can focus more on stories about peace, especially in times of conflict like we're in now with various wars around the world. And today's webinar specifically is looking at what lessons we can learn from constructive journalism. Constructive journalism is a relatively new and emerging way of doing journalism led by a number of scholars, including we're lucky to have some amazing researchers and practitioners here with us today who are doing work on constructive journalism. So they're going to talk about constructive journalism and try to apply these ideas to the broader understanding of how stories about peace could be better understood and promoted ideally. So let me introduce our panel. We have first Catherine Glindenson, an investigating journalist and author. She's published several books covering U.S. politics, media innovations, constructive journalism methods, and media critiques. She's specializing in OSINT methods, useful for climate change reporting and blockchain for social good. She has many other accomplishments. Her work has been featured in The Guardian, Huffington Post, TEDx Dresden, and by the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers. Our second presenter, I believe it's in this order, is it Betty Dam is next, right? An investigative journalist with a focus on Afghanistan, having authored two books that challenge Western narratives surrounding the country. Her expertise extends to teaching techniques for debasing knowledge at Sciences Po. Currently, she's in the final stages of completing her PhD, which entails a comprehensive 20-year review of the coverage of Afghanistan by the New York Times and Associated Press, drawing upon frameworks established by Daniel Hallen's work. And finally, Tanya Aitmurto, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where she leads the Media Democracy Lab. Tanya studies the impact of new media technologies on people's behavior in society. Her work has received several awards and been published in highly ranked academic venues, such as New Media in Society, Human Factors of Computing Systems, and Computer-Supported Cooperative Work and Social Computing. So all of our speakers have amazing credentials, and just to save time, I will, I think, proceed right to our first presenter. So Catherine, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Babak. What a privilege it is to be here. I am trying to share my screen. Just one moment. Yes. I hope everybody can see this.
Yes.
Thumbs up. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me, Babak. Peace journalism was not something that I knew a lot about when I ventured into constructive journalism 10 plus years ago. But I understand today that there's a lot of overlap, but I let scholars and other more insightful people to really determine where that overlap is. I would really like to tell you a story about how this journey began and where we are now on constructive journalism, and then end up with trying to tell you what we agree on definition-wise right now in our corner of the world, which is Europe and Scandinavia. So this journey began for me in 2008 when I was a US correspondent working in Washington, D.C. for the Danish Broadcasting Corporation. And I was interviewing a homeless woman in a shelter because of the economic recession. I was out there doing a news story on this and how bad everything was turning. And I suddenly realized that I was interviewing this woman at the shelter through a victim lens. And how did I realize that? It was because she suddenly said that she had also learned something about this hardship that she was in. And when I started to ask questions about that, oh, what have you learned? And how, she said, it's enriched my life and so on. So suddenly the interview went in a whole other direction than the one that I was there to harness from her or take from her. And that left me reflecting a lot on how we as trained news reporters, we have this kind of negativity bias. Some of us know that we have it, but a lot of us are not really conscious that we have it. And how does that influence the way we report on the world? If anyone here is interested to hear more about that whole aha moment, there's a TED Talk, as you mentioned, Babak, and I've left a link for that TED Talk here on this slide. So that started my journey with this homeless woman and realizing how I was shaping the world through a victim lens. So I had the opportunity to also study at the University of Pennsylvania while I was based in the US with scholars and academics who are looking into positive psychology, applied positive psychology, which is the part of the psychological domain in academics where you look at states of well-being and not so much of what you could say was the negative version of the world. And I realized by studying there that I, as a news reporter, knew a lot about some of these domains that you see here: negative emotions, post-traumatic stress, victims, negative relationship, conflict, and dissent. That was something I, as a news reporter, really was trained in, looking for when I'm going out into the field and reporting on something. This is something you learn in journalism school. But I knew nothing about what you could say more positive states like learned optimism, resilience, grit, post-traumatic growth, and peace building. So I had to go away from the journalistic domain and training and learn this with others. In this case, it was positive psychology, and realizing how much of a skewness and unbalance you create if you churn out journalists who only know about these negative states and not about the other ones. So that was my starting point to try to develop what we now call constructive journalism or constructive journalistic methods. So the method that I've been working with is very much informed by psychology. But some of my colleagues, they have other entryways and other inspiration, but we still work towards the same goal. So after a few years working with this and meeting other colleagues, and I worked 3 years in the Netherlands at a journalism school there, creating a department for constructive journalism, we tried to come up with a definition. And this definition you see on your screen here is mentioned in the book Reporting Beyond the Problem, which Karen McIntyre and Nicole Dahmen were editors on, and it came out in 2021. I really want to emphasize this book because it gives you a great updated look into the different domains. And also, I think there's a chapter on peace journalism, as I recollect. So the definition we put in there on constructive journalism was to portray the world more accurately by adding what classic news journalism tend to overlook: possible solutions, progress, nuances, and complexity, and a dialogue, not just a one-way communication with users and audiences. And this is attained through a range of different constructive journalistic methods. So why is it a range of different constructive journalistic methods, you might ask? It's because many of my colleagues and our colleagues had reflections like these. When I started to write about this and speak about this, I very quickly met up with others, or a colleague in another country would write me and say, oh, this is very aligned to some of the thinking that we're doing here, or some of the work that we're already doing here. For instance, in Sweden, you had the whole foreign news department at Swedish television, who had recently had an internal debate on how they covered Africa, the continent of Africa. First of all, why do we always call it Africa and not specific countries? That's a corner of the discussion. But also they had realized that the way that they reported on Africa through this victim lens with a negativity bias created a misunderstanding in the Swedish population around Africa. So if you asked a Swedish citizen, which they did, what are your knowledge about Africa? They would score very much to the negative side and not be accurate on what's really going on in Africa. So that was a wake-up moment for the Swedish television, where they said, we need to do something about the way we report our foreign news. So many colleagues had reflections like this. And I'm just going to play this video. I hope it's going live. So this will show you a map that we did. I did with good colleagues, called the Constructive Journalism Map. And if there's a link there, if any of you want to study it, but you can kind of see how many places in the world we had colleagues, newsrooms, journalism schools, different departments. If you click on one of those icons, it will take you to an address and a description of what they're doing there, especially in the Netherlands that we're zooming into now. We have a lot of activity, and of course also in Scandinavia, where I'm based now in Copenhagen. So we tried to create this constructive journalism map to be able to connect the community and connect newsrooms and schools and academics and practitioners. But the challenge with doing such a map is, how do you keep it updated and how do you keep it current? So we stopped updating it in 2021, I think, but it's still online and you can still go there and look into it if you're interested in it. But just to mention that we are pretty many people who have started this work and have this enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it. After a few years with this work and addressing the pushback we also got from the profession, some hardcore newsrooms were very critical about this and skeptical. We got some new help recently from this gentleman you see on your screen here. So that's a colleague of mine based in Denmark. His name is Peter Bro. He's a professor and the director of the Center of Journalism in one of 3 journalism schools we have in Denmark. And I would say it's the best one that he's heading. So he recently wrote this book, I think it came out last year, Constructive Journalism. And I can really recommend this book for anyone who wants to understand the history of constructive journalism, and not just the history that I just mentioned, where my journey started and others recently, because the fantastic thing that Peter is doing in this book is that he's looking at history, journalism history, and he points out that we actually had several waves of constructive forms of journalism early on. So in the book, he's mentioning the first wave called action journalism, stemming from the 19th century and spearheaded by 2 very prominent American media tycoons. So that's William R. Hearst, of course, you would know his name, and Joseph Pulitzer. They in their writings and in statements, they write that public service is the supreme end for journalism. And they would like to see a journalism that acts. So you have some of the same things that constructive journalism later on is mentioning and trying to get modern journalism to also do. So that was, you could say, the first wave of action journalism, where it has some alignment with constructive journalism later on. And then Peter mentions the second wave, which he calls public journalism, which is much more recent, where we have Jay Rosen and Davis Merritt. I'm sure my American colleagues would know both of them. So they were spearheading what was called public journalism. And some of the quotes that the 2 gentlemen is cited for in the books is highlighted with green. So they are calling on journalism to help society and act upon, rather than just learn about society's problems. And journalists should be fair-minded participants. So some of these wording and some of these values are with us in the third wave, which is then constructive journalism. So very recently spearheaded by some of my work. And you also see Ulrik Hårup, who is currently the CEO and founder of the Constructive Institute, which is based also in Denmark. So he's done a lot of work also together with a lot of other colleagues. So we have constructive journalism as a third wave. And here we also add a focus on the future and a look into how problems can be solved. So some overlap with the earlier waves, but also something that could be identified as new dimensions. So that was great to know that it's not just a thing that has happened because someone got a good idea, but it's actually a part of journalism's history that sometimes we come back to this, and it can be outside things happening in society that could really provoke this or foster this kind of thinking. And what Peter says in the book about constructive journalism currently is that it's not at all as progressive as the earlier waves. So the critique has been that it's very progressive and very out of the line thinking. But compared to earlier waves, it's actually a conservative movement. So that was interesting to realize for me. So all these active entities who've tried to work with constructive journalism came up with different methodology, different ways of how could we teach constructive journalism. And what you see on your screen now are the 6 pillars of constructive journalism that we developed in the Netherlands in that department at Windesheim University, where I was a couple of years back. So you have 6 pillars. It's solutions focus. It's what now, a future orientation, depolarization techniques, especially in debates, the interviewing of a journalist. How do you realize that you have a bias, a negativity bias, or maybe even also a gender bias and a Western bias? So enhancing and realizing, enhancing the lens of interviewing and working a lot with those biases. And then we also have a pillar about factfulness, which is adapted from the Swedish statistician Hans Rosling, who said that if you look at a data set and you look at a very large scale and maybe in a historical context, you'll be able to see, are we progressing or are we not progressing? So zooming out and taking a bigger look at something was something that he really emphasized, and something that we also think that belonged under that umbrella as a technique. And then engaging and co-creating with the audiences. So that dialogue dimension that I mentioned earlier was part of our methodology. But of course, others had other ways that they taught constructive journalism. The model you see on your screen now is from the Constructive Institute in Aarhus. So they have 3 pillars. They focus on solutions. They emphasize the covering of nuances in a story, so adding complexity into a story, and promoting democratic conversation. So that is a more simple model that they're using, but also a very strong way of teaching it, I would say. And the last one I want to show you is from the Norwegian national broadcaster, NRK. So this is a very visual model. So constructive journalism is the big brown domain you see here. And that the way that they see constructive journalism is dialogue, democratic debates. So some of the same things from the earlier model, nuanced information and explanation, and solutions-based journalism. So you see that's some overlap in many of the models. And sometimes you have journalism that hits them all. So that little center in the middle, if you hit that, you are very, very constructive. But they see constructive journalism as either of the one. You don't have to have all elements included to have a constructive journalistic story. So that was the model from NRK that they use currently. So what do we do with all this? You could say it's a very diverse field of methodology. So very recently, and that's 3 months back, the Foundation for a Danish-Norwegian Collaboration, we have such a foundation, contacted Peter, who wrote the book, the professor, and said, why don't we sit down in this community and try to bring together look at these definitions. Could we distill one definition that everyone would agree on? So we had a big meeting in Copenhagen with the colleagues from different countries in Scandinavia, but especially Denmark and Norway was present there. And very quickly we found out that we could not really agree on a definition, because some media, some newsrooms think it's very important with the dialogue and others do not. So you really have a diversity of opinion there. But what we could agree on was the overall aim. Why are we doing this? And it is actually back to this journalistic norm of portraying the world more accurately, working with our biases and enhancing dialogue with users. So right now we're working on a white paper, writing this down, writing this overall aim down, agreeing on that. I actually have the white paper right here. This is a draft. You could see it's a printout and a draft with a lot of scribbles on it. So we are not finished with this work, but it's ongoing right now. So in a few months, or maybe a month or so, we'll have a white paper where this is distilled, where we have put together the definitions and come up with an overall aim that we agree on, and pointing to great methods and great examples of constructive journalism. So there's an agreement on the overall aims, but not the definition. And we don't actually see that as a big problem here. I think maybe it's a European tendency where we realize that we are different in our different countries and we have different cultures in journalism and so on. So it's kind of part of the game, you could say, that we have this kind of diversity going on. And lastly, I will leave you with some mentions of key resources if anyone out there in this call would be interested. So, of course, the Solutions Journalism Network that you'll hear from the next panel, as I understand it, the Constructive Institute, who has fellowships and methods. And then we also have some online monthly sessions from something called the Nordic Forum, hosted by Tampere University, which is in Finland. They have online monthly sessions, free talks on constructive journalism. And the US textbook I mentioned that Karen McIntyre and Nicole Darman edited, Reporting Beyond the Problem. And then I also want to highlight a colleague of ours, Kaiser Lowe's. Maybe he's on this call. If you're here, Kaiser, thank you for doing this. He's updating a very comprehensive research and resource list. And I always point to this because it's the most comprehensive one I've seen. So if you click on that link, it's going to take you directly to that list. It's a list of books and research papers and talks, I think. And then lastly, my own book that I wrote a couple of years back is on the internet, and you can download it for free as a PDF there. So those are some of the resources I wanted to share with you. So
thank you so much.
I'm finished, and please stay in touch. My email is there, and I also added the links of my colleagues who are working with me, us on this white paper. Gert Maria May is the owner of Room of Solutions. And of course, there's a link there for the Center of Journalism that Peter is the director of. If you click on that link, it will take you directly to his profile and you can contact him there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next presentation, Betty. And can I just please request please keep it if possible to 10 minutes, just so we have some time for Q&A.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you for having me. I must say that Catherine, her work, I know, and at the same time, I'm also very sad to bring the results of an analysis of two newspapers who have covered the longest war of America. And nothing of what Catherine stands for can be seen in the coverage. It is very violence-driven. It's very focused on negativity, and it is very focused on United States policy. Let me see how I can quickly explain what I am doing. First of all, I don't know if you know who I am. I have written this book, which has changed my journalistic career quite a bit and pushed me into academia. This is a book on Mullah Omar. And it's unfortunate that this is the only book on Mullah Omar that has been written. And I wanted to give a face to the enemy, especially this one, because this one was very mysterious, and we didn't really know a lot about him. I made that story, and basically the PhD I do right now is like, well, how did I create this knowledge? And we compare it with how did the New York Times and Associated Press, but I could have picked Reuters or Washington Post with possible similar outcomes. So we compare. I have an autoethnographic study of how I did my work, and a couple of other freelancers who were also working in the periphery in Afghanistan, and compare it to the New York Times. What this book is about is actually it's actually a talk back tool to the master narrative that the United States created about what Afghanistan was according to them. And one of the very large parts of the problem analysis, which is the master narrative, which is a US story of what was problematic in Afghanistan, is that Mullah Omar and the Taliban were the biggest enemy and friends of Al-Qaeda and had to be chased. The constructive parts, or I don't know if you want to call it constructive parts, but other more professional analysis of what actually has happened in Afghanistan gives you a much more complex picture. So in order to explain you this research in 10 minutes, what I did is I basically took both the AP and the New York Times, and we selected from their large samples, we selected 700 articles each, and I wanted to do a very simple source categorization. So we went together with two students, we went through who is allowed to talk in the New York Times. When is this person talking? Is it in the beginning of the article or in the end? And who is not talking? And with that, I think I could show a couple of outcomes if you want. So we see with the New York Times that the total Western sources and the Afghan sources is more or less 50-50. With Associated Press, we see a much more heavy reliance on Western sources, 61.5%. And then we dive into these bigger categories. So we see the New York Times here has a 47.8% total of Western sources, but in there we see predominantly United States represented, and NATO, which can be seen as the United States because NATO has been led by the United States generals, except for one over 20 years, and the rest is UN and Europe. AP, well, as you can see, has also a large amount of United States sources, and also is a bit similar than the New York Times. If you look inside the United States representation, we see a dominance of United States governments and a lead from Washington quoted. This is the same for AP. And this is a debate that I am having right now with the New York Times colleagues who were also active in the field in the broadest sense, and also with AP about this very strong American link and reliance on US government sources. And the idea is that we will talk more with these two newspapers about these outcomes. And for that, Columbia University has just recently said that they will also come on board of this and see if we can not only write this PhD as a report and let it sit in a drawer, but have really an active next stage after the PhD is finished to engage with the news desks and talk about, for example, domestication in news, which we can see here, where we have every Western country does that, where we have a very strong angle, a national angle. Now, because I don't have a lot of time, I just will switch to something that is important to see, and that's this. If you have such an orthodox selection of sources, I didn't show you the Afghan side. Let me see where that is here. So the other side, just quickly, is the Afghan side, 52.2%, and for the AP is at 38.5% Afghan sources, and in both samples we see that they are predominantly also officials, so Afghan officials in Kabul who also speak as a language that is related to the war on terror. Sometimes they criticize the war on terror, but they stay in the frame, in the consensus that it is terrorism that we are dealing with in Afghanistan, and that military are the solutions, is the solution. We see also the Afghan civilians here in the draft, in these graphs, and what is interesting is, while in Afghanistan and probably in many other countries, Afghan civilians can be a very good source of witnessing local dynamics in villages. We do see them mostly quoted as victims of violence, and they are not really seen as a potential independent source. And I think that's a mistake, especially in Afghanistan, where you have a very family-oriented setup, where the dynamic in villages or towns or the capitals are very local and very important to understand for your coverage. So what happens when you have, as I said, such an orthodox selection of sources, mainly United States government? You get, of course, as we see here, a very simple wordsmith analysis, the frequency of words used. In the top, we do have focus on violence, and we do have a focus on officialdom. Afghanistan is another example of many other wars that we have covered where officialdom is prominent, and then for that also embraces the official narrative, which is again the war on terror. What we did overlook is something else, which we see here. Two narratives I am testing, and we will continue to test here in New York, is missed narratives or suppressed narratives or overlooked narratives. And that's two big ones. One is that we did have, after the toppling of the Taliban, the local parties, the president, Hamid Karzai, and the Taliban found a way to set up an amnesty. So that's very the other side of violence. So we do have a reality, an Afghan reality. And that means that for 3 to 4 years after 9/11, there was no war between the Afghan government or the Taliban. And this is called now by the United States government, people involved in this in Afghanistan, as a historical blunder by the US government. But I think it's also important that newspapers, and not only the New York Times and AP, but also the rest, Reuters and the legacy ones, have to have a moment of introspection. Because the word peace, the talks, negotiations, diplomacy, surrender, or amnesty are underrepresented in the coverage. They hardly have attention. We do see a little bit more attention for negotiations the moment the United States government initiates them. But initiation from the ground in Afghanistan is something that does not make it to the master narrative. And another one is that when you have a country where the war is basically over, where the local parties have found each other in an amnesty, and there is a moment of calmness, and you have an intervention from the outside that is not seeing this surrender as a possibility, and does ignore it, and instead increases the troops. And I think this is what I call a false reporting narrative, is that you add foreign weapons and foreign money, lots of money, to the budgets of the governors that are installed in this country, but there is no enemy. What we did see, that the United States presence actually promoted internal rivalries. So the governors and policemen had, because it's a family-oriented, tribal-oriented situation, had a long history. And in these histories, things have been tense between family members. Things have been tense for other reasons, but among family or further rivals, tarboers often called. Also, there is a tendency in a stateless country to work for your family and to enrich it. These families can be 500 members. And so what we see is that the arrival of the United States weapons and money under the label of this is a terrorism treatment, this is how we're going to kill the terrorists, was in reality perpetuating local conflict based on family, economical, or social aspects. And that, for example, the introspection is extremely necessary to see in a sort of dream scenario, in a utopian scenario of a review that we are talking about now in New York, of this 20 years of coverage, to see if we actually could have said, in the first 5 years when the Taliban had no reorganization yet, all these attacks that we have been communicating as Taliban, because we have done that consistently from 2001 to 2005, when the Taliban reorganized, we have them called them Taliban. Now, this is a very tip of the iceberg to show you that these that the way we are equipped right now in conflict, or maybe a topic where constructiveness, but where professionalism, basically, what I think is what Katrien is saying, is we need to have a professional journalism. We need to have journalism with a very healthy distance towards all the governments involved, including the United States. And for that, we need to have a discussion about what is global journalism. If we can, walk away from our own governments and have more of an diverse and complex perspective. Where also topics like peace, amnesty, but also tribal differences, or a lot of other realities than the violent narrative that the United States government came with, have a place. So that's more or less what I am working on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. And let's now move on to our final presentation by Tanya.
Thank you so much. I will need to stop your screen sharing and start mine here. Let me see that we're on the same page here. Are you seeing my slide? Yes. Okay, great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me here. Thanks, Babak, for bringing us together. It's an honorable situation to get to present alongside the great colleagues that we heard from already. So what I will focus on, so I'm going to be as brief as I possibly can. So I'm going to focus on three aspects in constructive journalism, which is first, give a little bit of a more conceptual and theoretical overview about constructive journalism, and compare it to some other alternative.
Sorry, can you please like adjust your screen sharing a little bit, because it's not really showing that much here.
So you're saying you're not seeing the screen? Okay, let me try.
It was a little bit narrow, so maybe
it's not properly displayed. That's why. So.
Okay, thanks for the heads up. Let me do this again. I'm gonna share a PDF version of it. How about this? Is this better?
Yeah, it's perfect like this.
Okay, great. So yeah, so first, a theoretical notion of constructive journalism, comparing it briefly to other alternative forms of journalism like peace journalism, and then moving on to a brief empirical review of recent studies about the effects of constructive journalism. And then finally, briefly talking about how could we unlock the full potential of constructive journalism, just like Bette was talking about, that there's so much work to be done. We don't necessarily see the effects of any constructive approaches in reporting about military conflicts or situations like we would have in Afghanistan. So I'm just gonna skip all this stuff up on my work. I just want to say that I work in, my main research question is about how we can use new media technologies for informing and engaging people to create a better society. And the technologies that I work on vary based on what's interesting and relevant at the time. So VR, AR, different aspects of artificial intelligence, crowdsourcing, collective intelligence are on my agenda currently. Couple of words about my background, because that will inform a lot what I will be talking about today. So I was born and raised in Lapland, Finland, in the middle of reindeer and snowmobiles. I worked as a journalist, reporter for the leading daily Finnish newspaper called the Helsingin Sanomat, and I was specialized in military and defense. And I also happened to do reporting in Afghanistan, the country of Bette's better expertise. And I must say, I was not aware of constructive journalism at the time, or peace journalism, and I discovered these concepts later. And had I been aware of that, I think it would have changed a lot of the framing that I had in my reporting there. I also done extensive work in different countries in the continent of Africa, for instance, in Angola, in West Africa, reporting about demining efforts there, which is more on then, taking care of the aftermath of these military conflicts, unfortunately, what needs to be done. And then I ended up returning back to academia, got a scholarship, studied and worked at Stanford University for a long time until I got here to the Midwest, to Chicago, where I now lead my lab, and I have a tenure track assistant professorship position here. So, okay, so let's talk about constructive journalism here. We already learned a lot of different aspects of constructive journalism. So what I want to summarize here for the context of my talk is that how I view constructive journalism, its import to us as journalism practitioners and scholars, is that the goal of constructive journalism is to have positive social impact on people by informing the public about social issues And particularly the focus is on suggesting effective solutions. And that brings us with this new notion, a new news criteria, Hello, Carlton and Rouge, which is social action, social change. And then moving on that spectrum, if you think about normative roles of journalism, traditionally, we have monitorial, facilitative, collaborative, and radical role of journalism. So these are the mostly used and observed normative roles that we have in journalism. Normative here means that the goal, what is the standard that we strive as journalists. And the monitorial role is that what you most prominently see in the practice of journalism. For instance, what Bete was talking about, the Afghanistan reporting, so that the journalists, like I did in Afghanistan back in the day, I was trying to be the neutral observer, reported about the agenda, what was going on there. I did meet some families and did some family interviews too, but I stayed out of the solutions frame. So now with the notion of constructive journalism, what's beautiful about this, that we can add one new normative role to this list, which is the constructive role, which means that if you look at the role of journalist here, so we become more of change agents who can document and develop and present these actionable solutions, which can then contribute to positive social change. But at the same time, the essence, the foundation of journalism remains the same. For instance, the Western, the Anglo-Saxon journalistic norms that distinguish journalism as a communication practice from other communication practices such as PR, propaganda, advocacy, advertising. Because without these journalistic norms of accuracy, authenticity, neutrality, we would not be able to know what's journalism, what's propaganda. Of course, the line is always there's tension and negotiation around it. So these norms say the same, whether we're talking about public journalism, which dates back to 1990s, which was coined by or brought forward in his book by the Stanford professor Ted Glasser. The idea of public journalism still follows these Western journalistic norms and practices. Same thing with peace journalism, and the same thing with constructive journalism. Okay, so that was more of the conceptual framework here. And then let's talk very briefly about the effects of constructive journalism based on empirical results. So meaning studies that have been conducted specifically about the impact of constructive journalism. And this review, all these papers were based on human subject experiments, which means that there's always a group that reads constructive journalism articles versus there's a control group who reads traditional, more negatively framed articles. And what was really interesting is that the papers pointed us towards this finding that, yes, constructive journalism articles can have a positive effect on the reader's feelings. So that was repeated in many different papers. However, these articles that use this constructive frame had a negative effect on comprehension in some cases. So we could make this cautious conclusion here that maybe constructive journalism is helpful in the sense that it provides a better mood for the users, the readers, but may not convey information that well necessarily. But I have that question mark there because we're just talking about a handful of studies, and as we know that in any human subject experiment, the stimuli is super important. So looking at the setup and all that, so we should definitely do more research into this, that what is it about comprehension? Why does the constructive frame somehow impede people's comprehension about these topics? Okay, so then finally, let's very briefly talk about how could we harness the full potential of constructive journalism. We have established that it's very necessary, and there can be positive impact on both on the micro level, on people's perspectives and their feelings, positive emotions, and at the macro level, we could potentially contribute to social progress. And then when I've been looking at these examples of constructive or solutions journalism, I noticed that even though the focus is on solutions and constructive framing, which is great, that's already a step forward, but I still see this notion of that the sourcing is very traditional. So it's mostly oftentimes asking the expert, going to the sourcing, interviewing people who have a certain status in society. Just like what Bete was saying in Afghanistan, these are officials that are being interviewed, not the regular people. And also the methods are oftentimes very traditional. It's writing stories like we have always done in journalism. So I was thinking about this, that how could we reform, how could we be more innovative in the realm of constructive journalism or in these other forms of alternative forms of journalism like peace journalism. And one way would be to use enhanced audience engagement methods, such as crowdsourcing and co-creation, which would allow us to tap into the online crowds and collective intelligence by using reader calls for knowledge search, also searching for solutions from the crowd, which has been proved to be helpful in many other realms beyond journalism too. And that way, we could potentially get participation from a more diverse and large crowd, get more information, create a variety of information that can contribute then both at the micro and macro level to this social progress that we want to see. Okay, so in the interest of time, with this, I would like to open a conversation about what ideas would we have for innovations within constructive journalism. And I also want to make this note that I'm not saying that crowdsourcing and co-creation, for instance, in constructive journalism would be something completely new. I've seen examples of these beautiful examples where this type of engagement methods have been used. However, what I'm calling for is like, how can we do this more? How can we do this better? What would be the role of these type of methods? And then finally, what other ideas for innovations would we have? Because I think that only through experiments, through different types of case studies, we can really take this field forward, whether it's constructive journalism or peace journalism. With this, thanks so much, and happy to have any questions and feedback.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And thank you to all our speakers for their wonderful presentations. We have a little bit of time now for Q&A. I've also just put up the poster for next week on solutions journalism. I think a few of our speakers might be here. Kaiser, I think, was here. Karen McIntyre, I think, has joined us. And I think we have also next week, she's not here on this panel, but Tina Rosenberg, who's one of the founders of the Solutions Journalism Network. So just a plug for next week as well. But let's hear if there's any questions for any of our panelists, or for all of them. Please, anyone. We're all still absorbing so much wonderful information, but I think I see Ann Phillips has her hand up. So Ann, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just have a question for the last speaker, actually, but very rich presentations. When you suggest expanding the methods for constructive journalism to include crowdsourcing and co-creation, what kind of protections might be in place that method wouldn't be hijacked by a small group with, outlier or extremist views? I just wonder, that seems very challenging to kind of filter, if you will, the chaff from the grain. Thank you.
Yeah, so that definitely is one of the, thanks for the question, challenges in crowdsourcing in any realm, that how do you post-process and synthesize the crowdsourced output? So what we do generally, whether it's journalism, for instance, ProPublica, the New York Times uses crowdsourcing all the time. They put out reader calls for information. So then there's a vetting process of the information. So same thing, I've worked a lot with different government bodies here in the US and in my home country, Finland, where we have crowdsourced policymaking processes. So we have asked the public to contribute with their idea. First, we wanted to map what the problem is, for instance, with certain policy, see what the public thinks and perceives the problem being in their everyday life. And then in the next step in this crowdsourcing efforts, we have asked them to come up with solutions to these problems. So now the difference is here, which is really important, is to keep it separate, that we're not asking for people's opinions. We're not doing like a crowdsourced opinion poll, because that would be very unscientific, because we're talking about self-selected group of people, not a representative sample, but we are looking for information, just like we are doing in journalism too. So it's an interesting parallel there, that we're looking for factual ideas, something that can be potentially helpful. And then we have a process when we do crowdsourcing for instance, for policymaking purposes, we have a process to analyze and synthesize the output. So there's a panel who vets the ideas, what's feasible, and so on. And then that can be channeled into policymaking, for instance. So what I was thinking that, for instance, in a peace journalism situation or constructive journalism situation, we could add, when we have, for instance, in climate change reporting, the more we could engage the public in proposing solutions for issues coming up, solutions that could be everyday lives, solutions about applications about renewable energies. And so that could be super helpful rather than talking only to the experts.
Thank you for that. We had a comment as well. I'll read it very quickly. Would one innovative way be to ask the officials, what are they doing to bring dialogue and peace talks? Usually officials are allowed to give the military angle and not challenged about what they're doing to bring peace, involve peace builders and women specifically to mediate conflicts. So I don't know if any of our speakers want to make a comment on that.
I think that would be a worthwhile approach to experiment with, absolutely. And I would also extend it from, okay, the first step is, yeah, let's ask the officials, the experts, how could we solve this problem? Let's say unfortunately, we have so many military conflicts going on right now. So how could we solve this problem? And then also involve the public in that. And then, of course, the closer the problem is to people's everyday lives, such as climate change, renewable energies, the more specific ideas and information you might get.
Thank you for that. And I think, Catherine, you had a question for Betty?
Yeah, just a comment to Jackie, who asked that question in the chat. We would work with that dimension under the pillar of constructive interviewing. So expanding the lens of what we ask our sources, that would definitely be part of that. So, and our experience is that it's very effective to ask these kind of questions. Then you really force these sources to start reflecting on it and expand their own thinking on it. So definitely, I think that's the right way to do it. So thank you, Jackie, for that. And then I had a question to Bette. How would you propose we work most impactful on biases and realizing the biases? What do you do?
Yeah, for me, that's the main question has always been, I wrote this PhD and I came with the data in the hope that I would be where I am now in New York, presenting this to the news desks. And that's not so, there's a lot of will and interest for the outcomes. And there's also a lot of reflection on the outcomes and sadness. And there's a will. And so what it requires time and diplomacy and strategy to see if we can sit together. For example, I feel in the connections I have now with them is there hasn't been for example, there hasn't been a review on any topic in our recent journalistic history. And being for 15 years in Afghanistan, you could see how narratives were changing, but we could not see that in our Western, mainly American newspapers. So it is, these moments are important. Like, can we have every year a strategic pause to see if we are still aligned to what is actually going on? Because they are so much in a hurry. The train is every time taking like a turn left or right on full speed. And it's like you're trying to reach the conductor, like, please listen to me. And that's what I'm doing now. And it's quite a journey. But I think you did that too, Catherine. I think you were in the Netherlands, a big name. I followed you. I think there was a good interest from newspapers to add complexity to questions. because that's basically what you want. We see in the New York Times and AP that the questions, I don't know the questions, but I see the answers in the newspapers, and it's always the same. Do you think the Taliban is getting bigger? Do you think we need more military to solve this problem? And in that realm, we are working. So we overlooked a lot. There was quite a huge information void, and well, by showing this information void and what is in that void, there is a sort of aha moment. But this is new, I think. To really, I'm not sure if it's new, but I haven't seen in academia, like there is that they jump in the car and drive to these media and say, stop, like we need a pause. And that's for 100,000 reasons, good reasons that these things will fail. But I come from a passion and a concern. If you've been in a country for so long and you've seen peace moments just simply overlooked, then there is something very, very wrong. And it's worth to if you make money, to do this as a job. It's really, it's really worth the try. Sorry.
Thank you so much. We're officially out of time, but we did have one last question. We'll make this the last one. If anyone has to go, that's totally fine. But this is from Ridwan. My question for the last speaker is, how does crowdsourcing impact the credibility of news reporting? I'm just curious. So we'll make that the last question, and please go ahead. I think
yeah. Thanks,
Tanya.
thanks, Ridwan. So in professional journalism, we always fact check all pieces of information, no matter what the source is, whether it is, or we should do that, whether it's crowdsourced information or whether it's an in-person interview with somebody. So in terms of credibility, if you started to publish information that doesn't, you can't verify, you take a risk to actually compromise your credibility and your journalistic authority. I'll paste this link into the chat here. I published a study about this based on several crowdsourced journalism efforts in Finland, Sweden, and also elsewhere. So that's exactly, you see cases where, in some cases, journalists are willing to take the risk to compromise the journalistic credibility and authority because they are so fascinated by the data they can get through crowdsourcing. But there's an interesting editorial process going on before that. But I hope that addressed your question. That's a great question.
Okay. Well, perfect. Thank you so much again to our panelists for all their wonderful presentations and for answering the questions, and for everyone here who joined us. Please join us next week as I put up the poster. It's on lessons from solutions journalism for how to grow peace journalism. And again, on behalf of the Media and Peacebuilding Project, the Global Peace Journalism, a project by Steve Youngblood and War Stories, Peace Stories, we want to thank you for coming to this, and thank you everyone for your wonderful participation. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Babak. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.